were some other kids on the block to play, and we're playing in garages on rooftops.
And then when did you start cutting music or writing music?
I got a tape recorder when I was about 12, and that was the beginning of the recording studio. That was a little flea market machine that had a microphone on.
Do you still have that in your studio and you use it sometimes in your mixes?
I wish I did, but it's long gone. But it was a one-stop shop. Had speakers on board and the mic and everything. All you did is press record, know where the mic is, and kind of do what we're doing, talking. Then I say, okay, Mark, let me wind it back, and then press the button, play, and there we were.
And that's when you started doing the work.
That's when I started recording, and my friends came over, and I got pretty good with that. And I bought a little 4-track, and then.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
When you were like 15 or something?
Actually, I had one before then called a Sony, and it had this function on it called sound on sound. So you'd record one thing, and then you put a sound on sound. It allowed you to go from the left channel to the right while recording the microphone again.
That's how you recorded that Neil Young record.
Yeah, the Neil Young record wasn't too far away from that.
Neil, you just play one guitar and I'll lay it down, then you play guitar again on top of it. That is sort of what that record is a little bit, right? It's almost sound on sound in a way.
Well, it's in the sense that he didn't want anybody else playing on the record. The invitation initially was, but I record him doing 10 solo acoustic songs and film him as well, because we make films as well.
Was that in your house?
Yeah, the one in Silver Lake,
Yeah.
And the beautiful old place from the 20s. And we emptied out the room, and we had a lovely setting for Neil and a really great sound. I presented him with my little Guild acoustic guitar, and I'd set up a sound in the studio prior to his arrival. And I said, check this out. And he played it. So he didn't even take his own guitar out of the case. He said, wow, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
So off we went. But we had a little secret weapon. We had an octave divider machine. It's just this little cheap contraption that you put the guitar through, and the low strings trigger an octave below. So the acoustic guitar suddenly had this seemingly a bass player playing with him, but it was just him on the guitar. And then whatever didn't get tracked properly by this cheap device, I supplemented. I went and repaired the notes that weren't tracked with my Moog Taurus pedals. So I did overdub on the record when Neil wasn't there.
Does he know that now? Did you tell him later?
He'll know now after we talk.
If he's listening. I think he's probably maybe got better things going on. But that's sort of, it's interesting because to me, a lot of the modern production, does, incorporate all these elements of a sort of analog and kind of a modern ancient sound that I associate with some sort of earlier time. Whether it be echo or noise textures, they seem to be rooted in something nostalgic almost.
Well, it's an interesting segue to the manipulation of sound, and I took an interest in that in the 70s. I worked with a Canadian producer named Bill Bryan, and he was always pushing me to weird things up a little bit, try adding this and that. And
that was the 70s, I guess.
Yeah, that was the 70s, and then
Were you already producing?
Oh yeah, I was already producing, and I made so many records as through the 70s. I was producing a lot of gospel records, funny enough.
Really?
Yep. I was associated with a Christian organization that brought quartets from all over the world to tour Canada, and they'd stop in my studio to make a record in 2 days. So I did a lot of that, and but I was also doing the more advanced experimental music, and that's what led me to meet Brian Eno.
Well, the gospel stuff, I mean, how did that affect you, those kind of vocal harmonies? Because, I do feel the history of something in the music when I listen to it. Did you find that I mean, I assume that you had to record the gospel singers pretty straight ahead, right? You didn't have to fuck with that too much.
Yeah, they were already very balanced acts, and so I had a 4-track studio in those days. I loved the gospel stuff because what I heard coming through the speakers was really my education about how parts fit together.
How so?
Well, I got to hear. Obviously, there's the fundamental. There's the bass part and the lead singing this one. Oh, and then there's the harmony below and the harmony above. So I got to hear
the layers.
How all the voices moved according to the chords, but serving the melody.
Right.
And this is the kind of stuff you might not get in a school. You can be in a school for 10 years and not be exposed to this kind of expertise.
Right.
So that happened over the course of a couple of years. So I got to hear some of the best singing, the best harmony singing from around the world. Just for doing gospel records.
And were you an engineer or actually producing?
I was more of an engineer, but I didn't know what a producer was then. So I was just doing everything,
Sure.
I just got called that eventually.
Right. and so tell me about this fellow from the 70s. What's his name again?
Oh, Billy Bryan?
Yeah. What's his story?
His story, he was in Toronto, drummer, producer, and he was recording a lot of the art bands from Toronto, and we recorded the Downchild Blues Band with Donnie Walsh. Donnie wrote a lot of songs for the Blues Brothers, so it was that association. But he was also recording a band called the Parachute Club, Mama Kia, and then the Time Twins. And the Time Twins went to New York and took the demos we made from my place, and they met Eno, and they played him the tape, and he really liked it. So that's how I got to meet Eno.
And when you met him, what year was that?
I met Eno late 79.
Had you been a fan before?
No,
You didn't know anything?
Didn't know anything about him.
So did you... So when you...
I lived in Hamilton. What do you think?
So, I know, man. It's hard to find that shit. You got to find a guy at a record store that turns you on to that stuff. You're not just going to... It's not going to land in your lap.
Yeah, I mean, there was no internet in those days, so...
No, man. I mean, if it wasn't for the guy who worked at the record store next to the restaurant I worked in high school, I would never know about Eno or The Residents or John Hassel or Harold Budd or Fred Frith. I mean, granted, I was 14 years old living in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I lucked out that guy dumped that stuff in my head, but you kind of need one of those guys.
You need one of those guys, yeah. Well, yeah, on the one night I got introduced to Grandmaster Flash and Kraftwerk from hanging out with the Time Twins. That's a big night.
That is a big night. That's a brain-changing night.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I thought the best grooves and then the most clever stuff coming out of Germany, So, like you said, we need those kind of those turning points, and it might be the guy in the record store, or maybe you got a girlfriend that's smarter than you,
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. I had that girlfriend that she turned me on to Roxy music. It all gets connected eventually. Everything gets connected. Then a guy left a Live in '69 Velvet Underground album in my apartment. I'm like, oh, and that's where that fits in,
Okay, yeah. Well, that'll do it. The whole New York chapter, yeah. I never got to New York.
No?
Well, I did, around 1981. That was my first time.
So with Eno, though, so this guy, you find out this dude likes you, and how is that presented to you? Because, I mean, that was, I assume, the beginning of, what is a continuing creative relationship, and I imagine friendship. I mean, that's going on 30-some-odd years, right?
Yeah. Well, he came into my life and my studio with these piano recordings by Harold Budd.
Yeah.
And he had already recorded the piano in New York, so he came to my studio with the view of processing on top, adding different sounds
because
and
of
textures.
Because of what he heard you do. He thought you'd be
That's
the guy to work with on this.
He was tired of the studios in New York, and he really appreciated. He rolled the dice on my place. And he really appreciated that we were a small town. We were, when I say we, myself and my brother Bob.
This was in Hamilton?
In Hamilton, and then we had small town manners.
But it's your studio. I guess I missed that part. You had started a studio in Hamilton.
Yeah, we finally got out of the basement of my mother's house, and at this point we'd bought a little building, one of those little Victorian houses, and we converted that into a recording studio. So it was a sweet little spot, and what was nice about it, it didn't have a feeling of rushing around.
Right.
We paid attention to every project that came in, and I was very impressed with how directed he was. His vision was very specific, and that I learned a little bit about him at that point, and I thought, man, this guy's done a lot, and he would devote himself to something that was seemingly quite obscure to me.
Right.
But I loved it, and I appreciated that he was willing to spend so much time with the details. And I thought to myself, well, I'm going to jump in with Eno on this and not just be hitting the ball all over the place, doing too many kind of records.
But before that, you had recorded a lot of different stuff, well, mostly local stuff, right?
Local, but I had I had a few hits in Canada because I was starting to rise up as a Canadian record producer. But I had to pay the bills, so we were recording whoever banged on the door, the studio. And
like
when I met Eno,
anyone I know.
Well, there was speaking of Rise Up, a band called the Parachute Club. We had a hit called Rise Up,
and that was the one that Eno heard.
No, he heard the Time Twins.
Oh, okay.
And he heard it was a more obscure thing, and but it was very, very full of adventure. Sonics, and that's what he responded to.
Oh, that's right. So you were making a couple of hits. You work with the Canadian acts, and then Eno, he sort of shifted your attention to something more specific that became sort of a creatively life-changing event, I imagine.
Yeah, I had never felt what I felt with him, and I thought, okay, I have reason to trust this man. And I love what he's doing, and I decided that I would never do anything I don't want to do again.
What was it about him? I mean, obviously, I mean, it's interesting to me that, your core sort of love of melody, and I think that Eno has that as well, aside from, what he's known for as a producer. The ambient records are not necessarily melody-driven like his earlier records, but it does seem that when you talk about your recorder, what is it, the penny whistle, that many of his early albums were kind of a fun and romping, and almost the melodies could have been penny whistle melodies, that he had an appreciation for those simple melodies.
Eno's a good singer, and he came up singing, and so he always had an appreciation for the center of the picture that way. I was able to help him make those records because not only was I a good technician, but I was musical. So, maybe I had more music education than him because he had come from art school.
Yeah.
So I was able to speed things along for him, move the process along according to his vision, and he appreciated that I was playing a good supporting role to him getting to where he wanted to get to.
What was the first Eno album that you did with him? It wasn't that Harold Budd, was it, or it was?
Yeah, it was that Harold Budd one called Plateau of Mirror.
Yeah, I have that record. Yeah, and I have the John Hassel records too. Did you work with the John Hassel too?
I made 3 John Hassel records. Yeah.
And what was the Eno solo record that you worked on?
Well, then we went on to do another Harold Budd record called The Pearl, and then we did one called Apollo. And
right,
Apollo was the one that I was more involved with because I played get back to steel guitar here, I played some steel guitar on Apollo. In fact, there's one track on there called Deep Blue Day that shows up in the Train Spotting movie.
Right, and also, like, it brought something to Eno. Like, was that did you just suggest that to him? Because I think that's like the third or fourth ambient record. And up to that point, it seemed like mostly, in my memory, to be synthesizers. And then on that record, like, those last few cuts are just sort of like, the slide takes center stage, and, it introduces something entirely new into Eno's sound. What was the discussions around that? Around you saying, like, go on, just lay down some country riffs in this ambient idea here.
Well, the Apollo record was meant to be a soundtrack for a documentary on the space missions, the Apollo.
Oh, okay.
That's why it's called Apollo. And the astronauts were listening to country music when they were in outer space. So we decided we would add I said, well, I got a steel guitar in the closet. Maybe we can add a little bit of twang that might relate to the film. And that's how it started.
Was it a steel guitar or a lap steel? Was it a lap, or it was a pedal or lap steel?
It was a pedal steel.